Right, let's hit it. Okay. This is part of the core curriculum, of course, and while it's not an absolute requirement, most of you are taking this class to fill the sciences requirement in the core. Back a few years ago, the core used to be called general education, and students have always expressed a certain amount of dissatisfaction with the fact that they have to take all of these gen ed courses. All of the stuff that is not in your major, that perhaps you're not interested in, perhaps you even really dislike, that you seem to have to take anyway just because it's good for you, like eating your Brussels sprouts or something like that. And some columnist for the Weekly Comma Splice back about 9 years ago pointed out that most UCA students seem to feel that the core, or the gen ed program as it was called at the time, was pretty pointless. So yes, some of you folks may be really interested in biology. Some of you may need it for your major. Many of you probably don't. And I can tell this because when I introduce myself to new people in town, I say, I teach at UCA, and they say, what do you teach? And I say, biology. And they give me this look like I have just told them that I bite the heads off of live chickens at carnivals or something like that. Ugh. Like, I guess they all got traumatized by it at some point. Or maybe they just hate it because they got taught biology in high school by the football coach whose means of teaching was, y'all just talk amongst yourselves. We got to work on installing the Wildcat offense for the game against Center Ridge. I could try to tell you that biology is often gorgeous, that there are beautiful things that we can see. I could remind you that it's extremely useful in fields ranging from, healthcare to conservation. Most of you are not going to be biologists, but all of you are going to need healthcare at some point of one type or another. Or I can tell you that biology will help you make informed decisions about complicated issues. Heck, the world has been gripped by a complicated issue for nearly the past 2 bleeping years. And the COVID pandemic has everything to do with biology. And in fact, about 2/3 of the way in, we will be talking about COVID and viruses in general. But screw that, you're probably concerned with jobs. You've taken out loans to get here, and you would probably very much like to get high-paying jobs that will let you pay off your student debt very quickly and end up in a corner office with a, house on 10 acres and a trophy wife or trophy husband or trophy spouse or what have you. Okay, I'm kind of assuming that's where many of you are. And this is why you need the core. As of about 10 years ago, and this is the latest stats I could find, but I have no reason to think that this has changed. As of about 10 years ago, only about 27% of US college graduates were getting jobs that were directly related to their majors. Your employers can always train you on the specifics. They don't necessarily need somebody with the knowledge that a college degree gives you. And in part, that's because the knowledge is constantly changing. Certainly, if you major in a field like computer science, the knowledge that you get is mostly going to be out of date, by the time you graduate, just because the field is moving so fast. Back when I was your age, taking a course somewhat like this in Percival Stern Hall a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, the internet did exist, but it was mostly computer science people in computer science departments talking to each other. There were a few dial-up services called BBSs, but there was no way to foretell that so many jobs would get replaced by the internet and so many would be created. Nobody knew what an Instagram influencer even was, or a social media director, or a chief information officer. All of this stuff was merely just a twinkle in the eye of a couple of geeks in Palo Alto, California. The world changes fast. People who study the job market refer to it as permanent whitewater. And people who are 50 right now, the latest stats I could found that they held an average of almost 12 different jobs between 18 and 48. And that pattern seems to be holding true. The days in which you would go to work for the company for 50 years and retire at the age of 70 with a gold watch and a fat pension, that's dead. You're going to be holding lots of different jobs. Some of them are going to have nothing to do with whatever the heck your major is in. If you're majoring in, I don't know, risk management, that's a good field, but there's no guarantee you're going to be able to get jobs in the field of insurance and risk management. You may well end up doing something else. The degree that you have pursued so avidly, jobs in that field may well all get taken over by computers, or, I don't know, skilled workers from Uzbekistan who are willing to work for less money. That happens. That happens all the time. If you want to survive, you can't specialize in one field. Don't make your mind into a carving knife. Make it into a Swiss Army knife. You need a range of different skills, a range of different experiences, a range of possibilities, a range of different ways of understanding. And that informs the way that I try to teach this course. There are facts that you do kind of need to have at your fingertips, but that's not the most important thing. 5 years down the road, it may not matter that you ever knew that typical human cells have 46 chromosomes. That you can always look up. That's why the gods gave us Wikipedia. What you need to understand is the process. What you need to understand is how science is actually done, that it's not a matter of memorizing that every typical human cell contains 46 chromosomes, or that mitochondria are the power plants of the cell, or all of these other stuff. That's not what matters. What matters is the process by which science is done. And I'm going to give you as much of that as I can. And understanding how that's done will give you some good mental cross training. Even if you never do science again in your life, there are still things that'll make you a sharper thinker, a better user of that 3 pounds of jelly meat in your skull, your brain. There are things that can make you better at that if you learn how science operates. And it touches a lot more areas of your lives than just this course. So what do I mean when I talk about how science is done? Well, scientists do go out and gather facts, like this person who is gathering facts with a microscope right now. The whole scientific enterprise depends on being able to observe the natural world. You go out and you look at something, or you study it with instruments that expand what your senses can do. And you ultimately, you can read what other people have observed, but ultimately, if you're doing science, you have to work with the thing that you're observing. I don't want to get too political here, but when people argue that they don't want to get the vaccine, or they want to take horse pills, or what's the latest, drinking your own urine or something like that, because they've done their own research, 10 times out of 9, they haven't done their own research. They've watched some YouTube videos. That doesn't count. Doing your own research on the COVID vaccines involves directly studying the COVID virus and the vaccines that we use. That unfortunately takes a bit more expertise and equipment than most people have, but that's the way you do science. You actually have to observe what it is that you're working on. And yeah, watching YouTube videos does not count as research, not for COVID and not for anything else. And for these observations to be valid, they have to be reproducible, meaning that anyone in the world who's got the instructions and the equipment should be able to observe the same thing that you did. If I'm pointing a telescope at the sky and I discover a new planet, then anybody else in the world who's got the same telescope ought to be able to point it at the same spot in the sky and see what I see, right? Anybody in the world should be able to confirm my observations. If I'm testing a new treatment for COVID and I observe that people that take it suddenly get better, then anybody else in the world who's got, the expertise should be able to give patients the same treatment and see the same thing that I saw. So science fundamentally depends on observation, and good observations have to be reproducible. Anybody who's got equipment, instructions, and expertise should be able to observe the same thing. But there was a much better scientist than I'll ever be once, who said that when he was in school, he was taught that scientists ought to stick to observation and not speculate and not theorize. And he said that at this rate, you might as well just go into a gravel pit and count the shape and the color of every little piece of gravel. That would certainly be observation, going into a gravel pit and observing every little piece of gravel. You could certainly gather a lot of facts about gravel. You'd have no shortage of facts that you could observe. Just one gravel pit is loaded with facts that you could observe and record. There's a virtually infinite number of things that you could observe about the natural world. And sometimes people do gather facts to try to work out a generalization of those facts. And starting with a bunch of specific facts and working towards a general law is called induction. And sometimes we do that. But how do you know what facts to look for? What guides you in deciding what it is that you're going to try to seek out? Given that there is a virtually infinite number of things that you could go out there and observe, how do you know when you can stop? How do you establish reasonable limits on all of your fact gathering? We do it by a method in science that we call the hypothetico-deductive method. Now, induction is you start with a bunch of isolated facts and you try to generalize them. Deduction is different. You start with a general idea and you try to arrive at specific conclusions from it. Like, here's induction. A friend of mine in college drank 10 rum and cokes and threw up and passed out. The next night he drank 10 vodka and cokes, threw up all over himself and passed out. The next night he drank 10 Jack Daniels and cokes, threw up and passed out. Those were all specific things that he did. And he made the general conclusion from those specific observations that Coca-Cola made you drunk. Okay, you may see certain problems with that reasoning, but the university where I was an undergrad had some strange chemicals in the water. That's induction. Deduction would be, okay, we know that alcohol tends to make people throw up and pass out, So I deduce that if I drink 10 drinks with a lot of alcohol in them, I will personally throw up and pass out and, get locked in the bear's den when they close, or whatever it is that happens. That's deduction, going from a general idea to specifics. And in this hypothetico-deductive method, a scientist starts by observing something that doesn't have a good explanation and formulating a hypothesis. That's a plausible statement about how some aspect of the world might work. Oftentimes, it's best to come up with more than one, because scientists tend to get really attached to their hypotheses. We love coming up with really cool, awesome, gosh, wouldn't it be nice explanations for how the world operates. And it can bias you if you get too attached to these. So in the method of multiple working hypotheses, you try to come up with several possible explanations for something, and that way you don't get too stuck on any single one. The deductive part is that you say, okay, if my hypothesis is true, then I deduce that I should see this, 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 and this if the hypothesis is true. My hypothesis is that drinks containing alcohol make you throw up and pass out. I deduce that if my hypothesis is true, then slamming enough Jack and Cokes at the Bear's Den will cause me to get drunk, throw up, dance around with my shirt off, and pass out, or whatever it is it might be. That's the deduction part of the hypothetico-deductive method. I'll say this for the benefit of the arts majors in here. There's a stereotype that science is uncreative, that it's got no soul, that it's basically a bunch of total nerds wearing lab coats and talking unintelligibly at each other and coming up with ideas that most people would find either ranging from incomprehensible to downright scary. And I'll say this for the benefit of the music majors, because there's always a few. Coming up with a really good hypothesis or a really elegant way to put that hypothesis to the test is a creative act. It's tough. It uses some of the same features of your brain as artistic creativity does. And a really cool hypothesis is just as beautiful and just as difficult to do as coming up with a beautiful painting or a beautiful dance or a James Jamerson bass line. Part of my goal in teaching this class is, to the best of my ability, I want to try to get you to hear some of this music, to appreciate some of the terrific hypotheses that people have come up with, not just because they're useful, but because they are beautiful expressions of what the human mind can do. But no matter how beautiful your hypothesis is, it ultimately has to stand or fall based on observations. And the scientist then puts her hypothesis through some sort of test. This could be a formal experiment, and I'll talk about exactly what that means on Friday. It could be less controlled forms of testing your hypothesis by observation. I'll talk about that today. Or in some cases, you might test certain hypotheses by modeling, making a model of what you're dealing with and working with that. And so the hypothesis can be either rejected or provisionally accepted. If it passes the test, then you say, okay, we'll go with it for now. If it doesn't pass the test, then you go back to where you started. And you say, okay, that didn't work. What about this other hypothesis? And you put that through the test. Even the hypotheses that you accept are always, always, always subject to further testing. Hopefully, the testing that you do will lead you to more hypotheses and your understanding ultimately grows. But if you come up with a hypothesis that cannot be put to the test, you're not doing science anymore. You're out of bounds. You're not necessarily bad for doing that, but if your hypothesis can't be tested, you are doing something other than science. Every hypothesis has to be testable in some way. I'll talk later, I'll talk more about this on Friday as to exactly what we mean when we say experiment. A lot of the exercises you may have done in high school might not qualify as actual experiments. On the other hand, quite a lot of things that you've done in your life that you may not have thought of as science probably did qualify as experiments. But let me say this for now. When you study anything in the universe, it's got characteristics that you can observe. Any of those characteristics that can change over time or that vary is what we call a variable. An experiment is designed so that you can not only identify variables, features of what you're looking at that can change, but you can demonstrate in a very precise way the effects of one or maybe just a couple of those variables out of many that are possible. And we'll talk more on Friday about exactly what I mean by variables and isolating variables. That'll come. There are lots of cases, though, where we can't do formal experiments because it's either physically impossible, not practical, or in some cases illegal or unethical. What you're looking at here is a picture taken by the Hubble Space Telescope of the remains of a star that exploded. Now, we're pretty sure that's what it is because on Earth, people saw this star explode back in the year 1063, almost 1,000 years ago. We have historical records of it. And of course, we didn't have the Hubble Space Telescope then, but people did see a bright light in the sky that shone brighter than the moon for a couple of weeks and then faded. And when astronomers pointed their telescopes at that spot, this is what they see. Now, exploding stars are something you can't do experiments on because we have no way to manipulate them, right? We can't get spacecraft to any stars, except for the sun. We couldn't reach the nearest star in anything less than tens of thousands of years. And even if we did, we don't have any way to poke and prod inside a star and see what happens. We have no way to make stars explode when we want them to, which is probably just as well. So we can't do experiments in the field of astronomy because we can't manipulate variables. We can't change the mass of a star or the temperature of a star and see if that makes it explode or not. What we can do is just observe exploding stars and the remnants that they leave behind and record as many variables as we can and try to use that data to test hypotheses that we might have about why stars explode. There's other fields of science, medicine, for example. There are cases where doing medical experiments on people might be scientifically sound, but unethical or even illegal. I could come up with a hypothesis that says if I surgically remove your brain, you won't regain consciousness. Okay, that's a hypothesis. Ethically, I couldn't do it because, doctors aren't allowed to remove entire brains. The best I could do would be to observe people that had had severe head injuries and see what happened. I could make observations, but I couldn't really do the experiment. So in other cases where we can't do direct experiments, scientists might run virtual experiments using models. You do this in engineering a lot. You could hypothesize that, let's say, a certain shape of airplane will be more efficient than other shapes. And you could test that hypothesis, but you wouldn't start by building a full-scale airplane and throwing it into the sky. You'd start by building physical models and testing them in wind tunnels, basically a tunnel with air pumped through it, so that you could observe how air flowed around your model. If you came up with a new building design that was, let's say, you thought was earthquake proof, you wouldn't test it by building the building. You'd build a model first and then shake it and see if it stood up or didn't stand up. So we can use physical modeling in some areas of science. We can also use computer modeling these days. These are computer models of what would happen if the moon crashed into the Earth, which I'm told is the subject of an exciting movie that's about to come out. Well, this is a computer model of what would happen if it really did. Obviously, we would not want to do this experiment directly. We can't test any hypotheses by making the moon crash into the Earth, and even if we had that power, we really would not want to. Right? I mean, I don't want to destroy the Earth because, like, that's where I keep my stuff. But we can test certain hypotheses using computer models, and those get better and better and more refined as we get more data and check our computer models against things that we can observe. And most fields of science would involve all three of these. Certainly in biology, in a lot of areas, what we've learned comes about from a mixture of controlled observations, formal experiments, and modeling. Ultimately, your hypothesis either is supported or it's rejected. If it's rejected, you go back to the drawing board. If it's supported, you still can test it further. A hypothesis, or sometimes a group of related hypotheses that has a wide application that you can apply to many different situations, and one that's been repeatedly tested and confirmed over and over, is called a theory. Remember this if you remember nothing else. Theory does not mean wild ass guess that some dork in a white lab coat pulled out of his butt. It gets used that way a lot. I blame bad science fiction movies where you have the mad scientist saying, "I have a theory that we can implant brain of duck into head of human." No, that's not what it means. Theory does not mean wild ass guess. A theory is a hypothesis that has been put through the ringer and that hasn't been disproven yet. You never get absolute proof of anything in science. The only thing that science has proved is that heartaches are healed by the sea. At least that's according to Garth Brooks in the song Two Pina Coladas. I assume you know that. It's country music. This is Arkansas. You all know the song. There is no absolute proof. I can't tell you that we've proved the law of gravity. I can tell you that we've tested the law of gravity over and over and over again, and it's always held up. And it's useful for predicting everything from, how fast a ball is falling when it hits the ground to, the trajectory of an intercontinental ballistic missile that we're going to use to, nuke Moscow or something. I mean, I hope we don't, but, these days, who knows? Any test of a hypothesis is always going to be limited in space and time. But a good theory has to predict what goes beyond what you've already tested. You can always disprove a theory. You never get 100% proof, but with repeated testing, you can get very high reliability. The material that we're going to be covering in this class sometimes gets torn down and replaced. It's never absolutely set in stone. We don't go up on Mount Sinai and come down with theories that have been handed down from on high that we must not question. But everything we are going to cover has been tested so much that we can put a great deal of trust in it. And again, a very common error is to assume that theory means speculation. But the theory of gravity, the theory of radioactivity, the atomic theory, the germ theory of disease and things like that, those are, quote, only theories, but we put them through so much testing that they work really well. They are not absolutely guaranteed to be eternal truths, but they work well enough for us. We can pretty well assume that they are close to the truth. Every now and then, though, even a very well-tested theory gets a shakeup. And this is kind of exciting when it happens. When you find out that, what you always thought was the case turns out to be not the best explanation for it, and we have to come up with new ideas. That's freaking cool. That is cool on the level of Appalachian State beating Michigan in football. That's a major upset. And that's the way that science grows and progresses. The fact that nothing is absolutely beyond question. There are always ways that we can refine our understanding. And sometimes that involves ditching what we thought were very solid theories and coming up with something better. And that's what makes science powerful. If you remember nothing else in this course, remember this. Science usually doesn't get things right the first time. Even good scientists make mistakes. Even good scientists don't always come up with the best ideas the first go around. We're humans. Human knowledge is imperfect. And trust me on this, the scientific community has its share of idiots, bigots, closed-minded, arrogant twits, even the occasional frauds and crooks. Not that many, but some. It does happen. I've met all of them at some point or another in my time. But science itself is self-correcting. Hypotheses that really don't work, sometimes people might cling to them for a while, but eventually they either get modified or ultimately torn down. Fraud may last for a while, but ultimately somebody's going to expose it. Errors and biases and things like that might persist for a while, maybe longer than they should, but eventually somebody comes back and says, hey, wow, this can't be right. And ultimately those things get dropped. One of the fun things about living in these times is, it's been confusing to follow the science surrounding COVID. And you're probably really sick of this shit. I know I am. But what it's given a lot of people is a ringside seat into the way that science really does work, which is sometimes very messy. In the beginning, we were encouraged to sanitize our work surfaces and, wash your hands for 30 seconds, things like that. Turns out we now know that that's not the main way that COVID spreads. So there's no longer that emphasis on hand washing and sanitation, but there's much more emphasis on masking. And this confuses and irritates some people, most of whom are on my Facebook feed, with things like, wait, well, scientists said this a year ago, and now they're telling us that. Do they really know what's going on? That's the way that science works. From my point of view, the process is working exactly as it should. That some of our earlier ideas about COVID turned out to be not the best ideas, not the best supported hypotheses, and we've gone ahead and replaced them and moved on. That's the way science is supposed to work. The process is working exactly as it should. It doesn't always satisfy people from other viewpoints, but the science itself is working fine. This is the way it always goes. It's just that usually the public doesn't get quite this close of a ringside seat. I'm going to finish by giving you a case study, and I'll warn you, I give you guys lots of examples in this course. I don't necessarily want you to memorize the case studies. What I want you to do is learn the principles that they show. I may not ask you a question about the brains of London cab drivers, which is what this case study is about, but I might ask you test questions that require you to understand the scientific method. So when I was a young lad like yourselves, sitting in a lecture hall in Percival Stern Hall, it was common knowledge that after your infancy, the brain quit adding new cells. You could lose brain cells if you got a head injury or if you drank too much, and you might compensate for the loss, but the idea was once those brain cells were gone, they were gone. You never gained any new ones. That was the orthodoxy back in 1987. Can't be that long ago. There's a number of studies have shown that that's not entirely true. And the one that I'll focus on was a study of cab drivers in the city of London in the United Kingdom, all the way across the Atlantic Ocean from here. And that's quite a long drive. Now, I've been to London. I don't know how many of you have, but I can tell you that, first of all, it's huge. Second of all, it still has a lot of this medieval street plan. There's 25,000 streets. They're not laid out on a nice, simple grid system. Many of them are one way only. And of course, there's always construction at, any, as there is in any big city. And there are many thousands of major buildings and landmarks. There are thousands of hotels, museums, 6 major train stations, important businesses and government offices and monuments and all of this. I mean, it's a really big city with a lot of things in it. If you want to be a licensed cab driver in London, you basically have to know the location of many thousands of these landmarks and be able to mentally plot a route from one landmark to the other, taking into account that the street system is really tangled and many of the streets are one way, and there's always construction or other things that might have blocked off some streets. But you have to be able to, if you're at the Covent Garden Opera House and somebody hails you a cab and says, "Take me to the American Embassy," boom, you have to go there. And yeah, this is not something that Google Maps can, Google Maps screws up regularly in Arkansas, and that's not nearly as complicated a place as London. People have to do this. And a licensed cab driver has to acquire what they call the knowledge. That's a detailed mental map of a 6-mile by 6-mile area of downtown London. And that usually takes 3 to 4 years of study. There's an exam you have to take. Nobody passes it the first time. I think typically the average number of times you have to take the exam to pass it is something like 13, right? It takes 3 to 4 years of detailed study to master the skill of plotting out traffic routes in London. Cab drivers call it the knowledge. It turns out there is a part of the brain buried deep inside called the hippocampus. You can just see it outlined here as a little red speck deep in the brain. We already knew that it was important in forming long-term memory. People with damage to the hippocampus may have difficulty, remembering what they did the day before or sometimes the hour before. They can't take short-term memories and store them for the long term. And by doing brain scans like these, it was known that the hippocampus was larger in qualified London cab drivers than in non-cab drivers or in people that had studied and dropped out. So we already knew that this part of the brain was bigger. Okay, but does that mean that people with big hippocampus regions are more likely to become cab drivers? Or does it mean that learning to drive a cab makes your hippocampus grow? That's the experiment that was done. They measured the volume of cab drivers' hippocampi, again, using brain scans. Nobody got their heads cut open. And it turned out that the volume of the hippocampus grows significantly in qualified cab drivers between the beginning and the end of training. That's what you're seeing on the left. That light gray bar was the size of the hippocampus in training, and the dark gray was the size after the training was over. And you can see that dark gray bar is quite a bit longer. That didn't happen in the people labeled non-qualified trainees, the dropouts, the people that decided it was too much trouble and went on to do something else with their lives. You also didn't get that growth in what we call control individuals, which means people that didn't do cab driving at all, people that never trained and had completely different jobs, right? Their hippocampi didn't get bigger. The hippocampi of the dropouts didn't get bigger. Only the people that stuck with it and qualified as London cab drivers experienced that growth of the brain in that time period. And there's further studies that have confirmed this. The brain not only can and does rewire and remodel itself, at least some parts of the brain are capable of adding new cells. Not all of the brain can necessarily do that, but some parts can, and the hippocampus is one part. If you really, really have to exercise your memory, like memorizing a detailed roadmap of the center of London, which might take you years to do, your brain can literally add new cells to the parts of your brain that are important in long-term memory. So the theory that I learned when I was an undergrad turns out to be not entirely correct. It's not the most accurate description of the brain, and we've replaced it with something more accurate, something better, something closer to the truth. And if you think about it, this could be really important. Maybe someday this will lead to new therapies that enable people to regrow damaged parts of the brain. Maybe it'll lead to better therapies for people with traumatic brain injury or something like that. We don't really know where it's going to lead. The work is certainly still not finished. There is lots more to do, but ultimately that's how science progresses. We had a theory that involved how brains grow, and we had to modify it and replace it with something new and something better. That could happen to anything that I teach you. What gives science its power is exactly that we don't have absolute certainty about what we think we know, and that all of our conclusions, no matter what they are, can be subject to revision as new data comes in. And on that inspiring note, I'm going to stop the recording right now.